All right. A few housekeeping chores first, and then a few introductory remarks, and we'll get right into the middle of this. First, the housekeeping chores. The reason that I've done these classes for years and years and years now is it's somewhat in terms of apologetics, and that is, I believe you should know why you believe what you believe. So everything that we're going to do is designed to arm each of us with more ammunition in our quiver to be able to spread God's word. This particular study that we're going to do over the next few weeks, there's not a lot of time spent on it, but it's one of the most important times in the entire Bible. So we're going to spend some time on that just so you're familiar with what's in the gap. What's in the gap between Malachi and Matthew? What's there? So with that in mind, all of you should have now three handouts in front of you. The handouts work this way. One of them are notes, and those are, I've kind of stripped down some of the notes that I have that you can kind of follow along, and you'll notice as you go through the notes, there's a slide next to it. That's related to the second handout. The second handout is virtually every one of the slides that we have here, you've got copies of, okay? I will make this point. I'll actually make 2 points. One, I was not prepared for how much it costs to print these. To that end, if you so desire, you may kick in, these are $25, well, for the whole package. So if you would like to, please do. Otherwise, we'll find a way to cover it. The second point I want to make is this. We're going to find places for corrections. In my notes, make sure you understand this. Anything that's good, proper, rightful, points to the Lord, that belongs to the Holy Spirit. Anything that needs correcting, that's misspelled, that is wrong philosophy, that belongs to me. So as we go through these, we're going to get the first one tonight on the very first page, after I read over it about 18 times, that I will tell you what the correction is. The third item I want you to be aware of is there are several different churches in this room, represented in this room tonight. Most of them, in fact, all of them, will have the same theology as almost everyone in this room. And I would hope over the coming weeks you'd spend a little time getting to know some of the other people. Fourthly, we are recording this. That means be very careful what you say. Actually, I never paid any attention to that rule, so you shouldn't have to either. This mic should pick up people around the room if you have a comment or want to say something. But I would encourage you to keep it short and loud so the mic can pick it up. The reason we're recording this is we've had a number of people over the years say two things. One, I'd like to go back and do an instant replay. And two, we have several people that can't be here that have been involved in our classes over the years that like to see them. Some of them as far away as North Carolina. So we'll be recording all of these, and each week you'll get an email from me with a link to a YouTube that you can go watch it, or feel free to send that link on to someone else. Some of the classes I've done in the past, we've used proprietary material, so we've had to make it private. Virtually everything you see here, broadcast however you want to. Next item in our housekeeping chores. When I was in college, I don't remember the year, but I had a physics class. And it met twice a week in the evenings. So that meant an hour and a half, because it was a 3-hour class. And the professor I had would walk in, and the first thing he'd say is, we're going to discuss this and this and this. Hold all your questions till the very end. Usually within 5 minutes, I had a question. Now, you're probably thinking, who in their right mind would have a physics question on a Tuesday night 5 minutes into the class? Ignore that part. My point is this. If you have a question, ask the question then. And it's going to come in one of three, there'll be one of three responses. Either it's something we can answer while we're here in what we're talking about, or it's going to be, I'm going to say, we're going to get to that here in a week or so. You can hold off until then. We're going to answer that question. Or I'm going to say, I have absolutely no idea, but that's a good homework assignment. So make sure you know what you're doing when you ask a question. Next housekeeping point. You'll see as you go through the notes that I've highlighted, and they're in bold black, I've highlighted verses that we're going to go back and forth to. When I say the intertestamental period is between the testaments, it is. But there's a remarkable amount of information in the Old Testament that links to what we're going to study. So I have some of those that we're going to read. When I say we, that means you, because I'd like you to volunteer, and I'm not going to assign them as we get through them. I'm hoping somebody will pick that one up and say, yeah, I'll talk about that, or I'll read that. So when we get there, please do so. And then finally, I think in our website it says this class was 6 to 8. It is not 6 to 8. It'll be 6 to maybe 7:15-ish, something like that, so we can get home at a decent time. The primary reason for that is I think you would get sick and tired of listening to me. So we're going to try to stop 7:15, somewhere in that range. Ian, you look like a great timekeeper. When I get to the 7:10 level, throw something at me or something, would you? Okay, that's kind of the housekeeping items. Two other somewhat related. On the counter back there, you'll see some world-famous cookies.
They smell really good. Whoever made them smells delicious.
Baked by, well, they're world famous to me, but baked by my trophy bride, Deborah. How was that, dear? It's good.
Got some points.
She'll also be playing the role of Vanna White tonight because we've got some things she's going to hold up that we can look at. So, cookies, water, whatever you'd like. Now, let's start then. In the email I sent out and in your packet, in the very first page, there's kind of a synopsis of what we're going to do. And you might notice that I titled this At Just the Right Time, the Intertestamental Period. So you might think, well, where does that come from? And I'll tell you where it came from. Deborah and I were having a discussion, and I think it might have been when we were watching one of the episodes of The Chosen. And Deborah said, why did all this happen when it happened? And immediately that triggered one of the verses in the Bible. You know, there are verses in the Bible that you read and you say, oh, okay. There are other verses in the Bible that bring you to your knees. In James chapter 5, one of the verses that brought me to my knees was, at just the right time, while you were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. And that's the first thing I thought of when she said, why was Christ here when he was here? Then I went on and I thought about, Paul goes on, and in Galatians he says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Jesus himself, on a number of occasions, says, it's not time yet. He tells his mother, this isn't time. He tells Peter, it's not time yet. What was the right time? Well, the short answer is, first of all, I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in providence. The reason it was the right time is God said this is the right time. But what we tend to miss when we turn the page from Malachi to Matthew is what the right time constituted, what happened in the right time. And if you go back and look at it, you see God's handprint all over everything in history. And a lot of what we'll look at is secular history, corroborating what the Bible says. We're going to see that throughout. So the long answer is because God said so. The short answer is 400 years worth of answer. We're going to fill in some of those blanks to see why it became the right time and how God used that period of time for two things. And the first was the culmination, or what I call the climax of his book, inarguably, the most important event in history. That was the birth, death, and resurrection of his son. That's the first reason. The second reason is God was setting up what was going to happen in the first 200 years of the church and from that time on in the spread of the gospel. Those are the two reasons we're going to look at this period of time. And I've separated this into two parts. Part one is going to be what we're going to do over the next, and you'll see a date in here. I've said we'd probably be through sometime before Thanksgiving with part one. That's going to be the intertestamental period. And then part two is going to be exegesis. That means just drawing out of the book of Acts. We're going to go through the book of Acts, and we're going to see virtually everything God put in motion in that 400-year period in Acts and in the spread of the gospel. We're going to see why the synagogue. We're going to see why language. We're going to see why a number of other things. So that's kind of the overview of where we're going to be through the rest of this semester. I kind of break these down into semester and into what I'll call the spring semester. If you go to page 2, there's an outline. And let me just hit a couple points of that. You'll notice I've got A, B, and C. By the way, that's something else you should probably know about me. I cannot think A, E. It's impossible for me. I have to go A, B, C, D, E. And sometimes A subpart 1, A subpart 2. Deborah, on the other hand, goes A, E. What's the problem? So if you get the impression that I'm struggling thinking through things, it's because I am. So A, B, and C. These are the three major blocks we're going to look at. And the first block is this, preparing for the gospel. 3 major historical events. So the first part is going to be historical, and we're going to weave in secular history with biblical history as we do it. I'm going to come back to that here in just a minute. The second part is going to be the rise of social groups. And I realize these really should not be called social groups. They should be called sects. Where do Pharisees come from? Where do Sadducees come from? Where do the Essenes come from? Who are the Herodians? All of those, every one of those, developed during the intertestamental period. The third thing we're going to look at is religious literature, the literature of the period. And in that, we're going to look at some interesting tidbits. The first one is called the Septuagint. The Septuagint, sometimes rendered LXX, means the 70. That was the Greek translation of the Old Testament that happened around 250 BC. It had a huge impact on how the Bible would develop over the years. I'm going to spend some time in what I call an excursus further down here when we get to that, talking about that. We're also going to talk a little bit about something called the Tanakh. The Tanakh is basically the Jewish Bible, and it stands for, the letters represent Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Those are Hebrew words, and those are the first 3 letters, and they basically stand for the law, the prophets, and the writings. That's the Hebrew Bible. We'll look at something called the Talmud. Won't spend a lot of time in it because that's going to become the oral tradition that's going to drive the Pharisees, that Jesus is going to say to them numerous times, "Woe to you Pharisees, you're on the wrong track." And then some false writings. And finally, I want you to look at item E, canon of Scripture. This is where we're going to take a little excursus. And an excursus is just a fancy word for saying I'm going to go off on a rabbit trail. And what that excursus is going to be is the difference between, I'm sure all of you have run into this before, how come your Bible doesn't have all the books it should have? Or how come my Bible has more books than yours does? Well, that's because there will be a period of time when and not just the Catholic Church, in fact, if you look at all the churches that use something called the Septuagint, you will find there are more Christians around the world that follow the writings of the Septuagint than there are follow the Protestant Bible. And all these books that we're going to talk about happen in this period of time as well. So in that excursus, I want to explain a little bit about how that came about, why it came about, and most importantly, what happens in the Reformation when that occurs. And we'll talk about first the Reformation and then something called the Anti-Reformation. So that's where we're going to be for the next few weeks. I want to go back to the first section we're going to be in. 3 major historical events: the Diaspora, Hellenization, Pax Romana. We're going to dissect each of these, but let me start it this way. If I were to say to you, name 3 men most responsible for the spread of the gospel, who would you name? Paul? Who else? John? Anybody else? Constantine? Oh, yeah, I'll buy that to some degree. Well, let me give you 3 names that you're going to say, what are you talking about? Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander the Great, and the Roman general Pompey. Now you're thinking, where do you find any of those in the Bible? Well, you find Nebuchadnezzar there. But let's look at these 3 items for just a minute. First of all, the Diaspora. You're going to see that's from 722 to about 135. I've used Nebuchadnezzar as kind of the poster child for something called the Diaspora. Diaspora is just a Greek term, later become Latin term, meaning dispersion. And it had to do with the dispersion of the Jews around the world. Are you with me? Then Alexander the Great. You'll see Hellenization. Hellenization is just another 25-cent word you get in seminary for spreading Greek philosophy and the Greek language throughout the entire known world. The third item, Pax Romana, that's Latin for peace of Rome. And we're going to use Pompey as kind of our figurehead for that. Now, why would I say those 3 things are important? Well, let me ask you this. Oh, I started to stand up. I can't because we're recording. Typically, I'm a wanderer. I tend to wander around, but I guess I'll have to nail my foot to the floor. Think about those 3 things for just a minute. If you wanted to spread if you wanted to spread any message, what would be the 3 things that would be most helpful for you in spreading that message? Language, right? If you were going to deepest, darkest Africa and didn't know whatever the language was, how effective are you going to be? So language would be one of them for sure. What else? People. If you went to deepest, darkest Africa and you were going to spread the gospel message and you happen to know the language of the people there, how much more helpful would it be if some of those people already knew the message that you were spreading, right? So first, we have people being spread out, people who know the message. Secondly, we have a common language that we can use. And in the spread of the gospel, and even in Jesus' time, the common language is going to be Greek. We're going to see where that comes from. And then the third thing that you'd really want is this. If you're going into deepest, darkest Africa and you're going to land a plane, you probably don't want to land it where there's people who kill you, right? You probably want someplace where there's some peace. So if you think about it, spreading any kind of message, you'd want people there to help you. You'd want a common language, and you'd want a peaceful environment to do it. That's the Pax Romana. Those 3 things, I think, not just I, but are primarily responsible for the spread of the gospel and what's going to happen in Jesus' time. Everybody following me so far? Let's go down 1, piece 2, rise of the sects. I've already talked a little bit about this. We tend to think, let me back up for just a minute. How many of you have read the Bible and you finish Malachi, right? You turn the page and you start Matthew, right? How many of you have thought, because I did, how many of you thought, well, it had to be the next day. Malachi went to bed, Matthew got up, right? Well, the reality is everything we're talking about all happened in that period of time. And I'm going to set a timeline for you here in just a minute, including groups that we think when we read the New Testament, had been around forever and ever and ever. Well, guess what? They were not. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Zealots, Simon the Zealot, all of those come about in the last 200 years before the time of Christ. Yet we tend to think of them as being institutionalized. They are not. In fact, of those groups, in the Pharisees, Josephus, one of the writers we're going to talk about, Josephus says there were probably only 6,000 Pharisees in all of Israel during the time of Christ. Probably only 2,000 Sadducees. Herodians were even fewer. Those were the people that followed Herod. So the rise of the sects, all began, call it 167, and you're going to see why that date is important when we get into this, in the time of Jesus. And then finally, we talked already about the literature of the period. So, with all that in mind, we can start. Some of you have probably already looked at this slide and wondered, what in the world is that? Has anybody ever seen this before? Have you? Anybody else? Oh, good. Then I'm not going to talk about it. I'm kidding. I titled this is my title, by the way, The Bible Rainbow. We tend to think of the Bible probably as, 66 different books. Or at a minimum, we tend to think of it as Old Testament, New Testament, right? Here's the reality. It's one story told over 4,000 years. And it has bookends. And by the way, here's your first correction of the night. If you're on page 3, go down to slide 2, and then item 1, tend to think of the Bible. Item 2, act as one story. Look at the next item. Item 1, bookends, the first 2 chapters of Exodus. That should be Genesis. Although, go read the first 2 chapters of Exodus too. That's pretty good. But it should be Genesis, because I'm going to make the point that the Bible has bookends. In the first 2 chapters of Genesis, it begins with the creation of heaven and earth. In the last 2 chapters of Revelation, it ends with a new heaven and a new earth. In the first 2 chapters, it begins in a perfect garden. In the last 2 chapters of Revelation, it ends with a perfect garden. In the first 2 chapters of Genesis, it begins with man being called very good. In the last 2 chapters of Revelation, it ends with man being made perfect by Jesus' sacrifice. Those are the bookends, 2 chapters on each end of the Bible. Everything in between is a story of salvation. Now, if that's the case, why in the world would God leave out 400 years of probably the most important part of Christ's history? The answer is he wouldn't. Now, let me spend just a little time. Sorry? Oh, what part? All of it?
He wouldn't.
Oh, he wouldn't. Gosh, I was thinking, all of it? We're going to start this all over. So let me explain a little bit about what you're seeing here. Excuse me. Chris Harrison is responsible for this, and actually he worked with a compatriot whose name I don't recall right now. Here's what they did. How many of you have a study Bible? You look in the margins of the study Bible, somewhere on there, it's going to have references, and it's going to reference something from whatever you're reading to another book in the Bible, and it's going to give you a chapter and a verse. They took all of those references and did a database of them. But the database didn't really reflect what it shows. So what they did is they drew arcs for each of those references when they referenced one book of the Bible to the other book of the Bible. So as you look at this, and you look in your handout, if you go to the very far left, see the white line down there, the very far right line? That's the book of Genesis. And in Genesis, that's the first chapter of in the book of Genesis. And here's what that first chapter is going to say. God created the heavens and the earth. Right? Well, go to Revelation 4:11. You know what you're going to find? and this is John saying, for you created all the things, and by your will they were created. That's the link between these verses. Every one of these dashes you see on the bottom here, each one of those, and they're slightly different colors, so you can kind of differentiate them. Every one of them is a book of the Bible, and every one of them is a chapter of the Bible, and in every one of them you will find a reference from one point to another point, and that's what the ark is. Everybody still follow me? Let's see. So, as I said, if that's all true, if this is all true, if it is one story, would God leave out a fairly important part of the story? 400 years worth. And I'm going to say he did not. That's what we're going to discover in the coming days. Now, first of all, you need to understand that this period of time is known by a number of different names. We've called it Intertestamental, which it is. Inter meaning the time between the testaments, right? It's also known as the silent years, as the time between the testaments. It's got a number of different monikers. Frankly, none of them do him justice, because all of them make it appear as though this is kind of an afterthought. It was kind of like, oh, I forgot to put this in, so I'm going to make an appendix out of it. That's not the case. It's extremely important, but none of the particular names do them justice, especially when you say the silent years. The reason they are silent is because in the Jewish Bible ends with the prophet Malachi. Actually, the Jewish Bible ends with Chronicles, but the last prophet is Malachi. You don't see anything again until the next prophet, and the next prophet is who? John the Baptist. So, although you probably won't find John the Baptist in a Jewish Bible. So that period of time has been referred to as the silent years. But as you're going to see, it was anything but silent. So now, let's spend a little more time with a couple of the slides. If you'll go to slide number 3. You should see something called the timeline of the Bible. And hopefully you can read all these. One of the slides I created in a larger format because it's very small print, but you'll see it when we get there. That should help. Notice the timeline of the Bible here. On the very left, let me see if I can get this guy to work over here. Oh, good. On the very left-hand side, you see all this? What does it say? Old Testament, right? And then we get to leap over here and we see New Testament, right? Well, what is this huge gap in the middle? That's the period of time we're talking about. That's the intertestamental period. You'll see a number of words here that you probably want to note. Something called the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha were what I'm going to call extra biblical books that we'll talk about and how they came to be. You're also going to see something down here called the Septuagint. Remember when I mentioned earlier the LXX? That's the Greek translation of the Bible. When that Greek translation is written, 15 additional books were added to the Jerusalem Old Testament. And we'll differentiate between a couple of Old Testaments as we go along here. And then the final thing I wanted you to notice is right here in the middle, kind of small, see this little gap right here? That's the entire New Testament period. Well, the entire writings of the New Testament period. Probably, although you will find people that believe Galatians may have been the first book written, probably 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, written barely 20 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. And the last book, obviously, is going to be Revelation, probably written 95 to 100. By the way, for those of you who say the Bible can't be trusted as history, the Bible is quoted more by historians than practically any other book. Furthermore, most historians, if you went to read a history right now, pick out a history of anyone you wanted to read, you know what you're going to find? There's a period, in some cases, of 200, maybe 300 years between the life of that period and when that history is written. You know when the history of Jesus Christ is written? Within the first 60 years. Every book of the New Testament is completed with it in the first 30 years, 60 years after the crucifixion. the last being John's writings. Most of them, including all of Paul's books, are going to be completed before 67. So we're talking 30 years or so. So this is the period of time we're looking at. And then I've got a couple of other slides that will help you understand every kind of the pieces we've talked about to this point. And that's this slide. We're going to keep coming back to this 400 years, because virtually everybody who studies or teaches the intertestamental period is going to break it down into 4 main categories. And that is the Persian period, the Greek or Macedonian period, the Maccabean period, and the Roman period. Now you're probably saying, I'm looking at your chart and you have more than that. Well, there's a reason. The Greek or Macedonian period has some subsets, if you think about it. That's the Egyptian period and the Syrian period. What's going to happen under the Greek or Macedonian period, when Alexander the Great conquers the world, on his death, 4 generals are going to take over. One of them is going to be in Syria, one of them is going to be in Egypt. So you might think of that whole Hellenization period as a subset of Alexander the Great. But the main periods are the Persian period, the Greek period, the Maccabean period, and the Roman period. And that's the way we're going to look at each of these. Let's see. And as I said, almost every writer that deals with this period of time will break it down in those 4 areas. And you'll find out why here in a second. I keep saying you'll find out why in a second, don't I? We've got a lot of stuff we've got to find out. Are you making a list?
What's that, Tom?
Are you making a list of all the stuff we're going to find out? I want to look at 2 other slides on this period of time. Timeline of the silent years. If you're in slide 5, there's a couple points here that you probably will note. You see this little guy up here? That's Malachi. He's the last prophet. You can see the gap between Malachi and actually Herod the Great's the closest we can come. You can see the gap of time. And there's some points to look at. One is, can you see these guys down here? These are the leaders during the period of time. We're going to see some of these in the Bible. We're going to see Cyrus the Great. We're going to see Artaxerxes. We're going to see Xerxes. Those are going to be in the Bible. They're corroborated by extra biblical evidence. In other words, if we went to find in the annals of Darius, we would probably find, or Darius, however you want to say it, we would probably find reference to the time that he conquered or spent in in Israel. So this is all coming from the Bible. This is corroborated by a number of sources around the world that are extra biblical. And then I wanted to point out one other thing on this particular chart, and it's right down here. Whoops. Right down here. Can you read whatever that says? Jewish rule. From the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem in 586 BC. When he does, he decimates Jerusalem. He decimates Israel. Israel's carried into, the last of Judah is carried into captivity. Israel ceases to exist at that moment in time as a nation. It will not exist again as a nation until 1947 due to partition. Charles?
48. Yeah, 48.
47. Actually, you're right. The document isn't signed until 1948. It happens in 1947. So let me think. I want to see how important our discussion is, Charles. We just skipped to 2,000 years and we're going to argue about a year. I'm going to go with you. Let's say 1948. So correct what I said, 1948. The point is, Israel is the only nation that is reconstituted, the only nation in history that is reconstituted after being decimated, with the exception of one period of time. See that 100 years? That's the period of the Maccabees. We'll talk a lot about the Maccabees. That happens during the intertestamental period. All right. Now, This is probably the best overall handout. If you, as soon as I can get back to my page here, if you would like, and you've got it in your handouts, and then I created a larger version of it that was by itself because it's a little hard to read. This is probably the best overall view of the period and in the handouts. And if you want, if you'll take this with you and memorize it, you can walk out the door right now because you don't need to know anything else. Seriously, it's all pretty much here. So let me just hit the high points. First of all, go up in the very top section and you'll find something in the left-hand corner that says World Leaders. King Cyrus, we know a little bit about. Let's put this in context of extra biblical writers or thinkers. Plato, it's about the same period of time. Alexander the Great, Aristotle. So at the timeline, as you can see, if you look down at the very bottom, the timeline is, well, here we go. There we go. Touch you, little guy. Very top. Oh, thanks. See down here where it says the timeline of the intertestamental period? So move from left to right, 400 to about 5 BC. And that's when all of this lays out. I want you to notice something else. At about the second grouping, on religious groups, rulers, etc., notice who pops up about halfway in the period. Rabbis, scribes, Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees. You know that we tend to think of, especially when we read the New Testament, that rabbis have been around for a long time. Rabbis don't come into existence until about 200 BC. 200 BC. And they come into existence, there's a reason for that. They come into existence primarily because when Nebuchadnezzar decimates Jerusalem in 586 and carries everybody into captivity, what happens? Where's the temple? Can't I just go to the temple and do everything I'm supposed to do? The temple's gone. The leaders are gone. There's nobody there. So what happens? Well, rabbis, began to teach what all that was about. We'll spend a lot of time on that. I want to do 2 more things and then we can kind of move on. And that is this. You'll see the third line down, it says fulfill prophecy. I want you to look at Ezekiel, Daniel, specifically Ezekiel, Daniel, somewhat Zechariah. All of those are prophesying things that are going to happen in the early period of the intertestamental period. All the way at the end with Joel, Micah, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and Isaiah. Those are all messianic prophecies. I'm pointing this out because Daniel is going to serve a huge role in describing what's happening what will happen in this period of time. Daniel's prophecy, especially in chapter 2 and chapter 8. Has anybody ever studied Daniel? Yeah.
The DSF studies it next week.
Oh, is it? Well, then you'll know everything you need to know about it. If I were to pick the 2 hardest books, I have 3 hardest books I have ever taught. It would start with Revelation. It'd move rapidly to Ezekiel, and even more rapidly to Daniel, and especially the last 6 chapters of Daniel. What we're going to find here is Daniel's going to prophesy. He's going to tell us almost everything that's going to happen in this period of time. From Babylon to the Persians, to the Romans, and to the Greeks, to the Romans, all of that's going to end up in Daniel's prophecy. All right, now let's go back, if we could, to slide 4, and the Persian period. We've talked a little bit about this before. When I say we're going to start with the Persian period, we really aren't. I was lying. Wasn't lying. We're going to go back a little bit before the Persian period to something called the pre-Persian period. And that's going to be during the time of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And you'll find out why. In fact, you're going to find out why in about 30 seconds. But before we can do that, I need everybody remembers who Vanna is?
Yeah.
Vanna is going to help us with some sources. First of all, some of you have study Bible, right? Anybody have the ESV study Bible? Oh, good job, Vanna. You'll have to show the guests behind you. The ESV Study Bible has probably the best treatment of the intertestamental period of any study Bible I've found. It's excellent if you get a chance. Many study Bibles will have something on the intertestamental period. Somebody has a MacArthur Study Bible.
We do.
Do you? Does it have anything on the intertestamental period? Well, that's part. We usually don't. Yep.
Is it after Malachi?
It's after Malachi. Yep.
The Italian problem.
Or it could be. Sometimes they'll put it at the back of the Bible as an appendix. But a lot of the study Bibles will have at least a treatment on it. The NIV has it. There's several of them that do. Some of them are only a page long, and that kind of pique your interest, but they don't really tell you much about it. The ESV has a great one. But the sources for everything we talk about are going to come from some main writers. The first one of those is Flavius Josephus. Good job, Anna.
Get her, dude.
You probably want to pass that around. For those of you who would like to borrow it, I'll be happy to lend it to you. First of all, you're going to find the type is about 3-point and very difficult to read. But Josephus was a historian in the first century. And many later historians rely on Josephus. Josephus tells us a whole lot about this period of time. Philo, who was a Hellenistic Jewish writer from Alexandria, was a Greek philosopher who we also get a monumental amount of information from. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which I didn't bring a copy of, but, well, actually, you can't bring a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've got a great book on it if you want to read it. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm virtually everything that we find in the intertestamental period. And then probably one of the most important is going to be something called First and Second Maccabees. You want to hold that one up? Nope, it's the Jerusalem Bible. The Jerusalem Bible has the Apocrypha in it. I keep saying this word Apocrypha. You're going to learn that. The Apocrypha are those additional books. In the Apocrypha are two historical books called the Book of the Maccabees. In the Maccabees, we're going to find a lot of what occurs, including, some of you have probably heard the phrase, the abomination that causes desolation. That's where we're going to find the Maccabees. The Maccabees is going to report on it. We're also going to find, does anybody know what purgatory is? Okay. Pardon?
Only from what you told me.
Oh, well, trust me, Dale, you'll end up there. Obviously, that's tongue-in-cheek. The Maccabees is, and we'll come to it, is one of the sources for the rationale for something called purgatory. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into it, too. And finally, all of those are summarized. And first of all, if you went to try to find resource materials on this period of time, there's not a ton of them. Deb, the next 3 books, you can just hold them up one at a time as you want. They're all going to have similar pieces to them that will rely on Josephus, on Philo, on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and on the Maccabees for pretty much all that they do. I will ultimately do a bibliography at the end of this class that will give you all of them, because I'm sure you're going to want to go out and buy them if you want more study. All right, so now we've kind of laid the groundwork for everything. Why don't we start, and you should be on page 4 now, with something called the pre-Persian period. I said we were going to start with the Persian period, but we're actually starting with something called the pre-Persian period. And there's a reason I want to do that. And here's what it is. First of all, if we were just to break down the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, we'd break it down into the law. That's going to be Moses' law. And then we get to Joshua, and then we get to Judges, right? And then we're going to get to 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Samuel is something called the golden years of Israel. It's a period of 120 years when Saul, David, and Solomon are the kings. In that, it's a relatively short period of time because right after that, what begins? Around 930 BC, and I'm going to expect you to remember all of these dates. Around 930 BC, Solomon dies, and he leaves the kingdom in the hands of his son Rehoboam. Now, if you go back and read 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, especially in 1st Kings, you're going to find where God says to Solomon, man, you've gone down the wrong track. You've done everything I said don't do. You've accumulated, as a king, you've accumulated wealth beyond your means that you don't need. You've accumulated horses. You've accumulated 300 concubines and 700 wives. I might have those reversed. But so he says, as a result, I'm going to split the kingdom from you. I'm going to divide the kingdom. And when he does, on his death, within a matter of years, Rehoboam takes control of something that will be called the southern kingdom, Judah. Jeroboam, if I were writing the Bible, I'd come up with better names. But Rehoboam and Jeroboam now become the kings of, respectively, Judah, which is southern Israel, and Israel, which is the northern kingdom. If you start reading Kings, here's what you're going to find out. Good king, bad king. Good king, bad king. Good king, bad king. Good king, bad king, bad king, bad king, bad king, bad king. Right? You get to the end of Kings, you go, man, I don't know whether to kill myself or go bowling. So the period of the Kings is important for a couple of reasons for us. And the first period I want you to focus on is the period of 722. I put the two pre-Persian empires up here. They look almost identical, don't they?
Who was David?
So Saul 1050 to 1010, David 1010 to whatever 40 years later is, 970, and then Solomon 970 to 930. Yeah, I'm not going to confuse things. The reason I hesitated for a minute is I'm giving you what I would call the orthodox or traditional position of when all those occurred. You will find people that say, no, it didn't happen here, it didn't happen there. Trust me, they're wrong.
And so how is this I guess that's a very broad question. Like source, how is it how do you bring a date to this? I'm sure we could talk about this for hours. Just in a very broad term.
Well, I can tell you exactly where it comes from. It's in 2 Kings chapter 6, I think. I'll check for sure. And it says 400 and some odd years after Israel came out of Egypt, Solomon was made king. And so everything prior to that is set from that period of time. That's why there are some people that say, no, that's not right. So you're basically using the time of Solomon and Solomon's writings to say from 400 years before that was the time they came out of Israel. That's how the whole calendar gets set. There's a lot of controversy about it. They're all wrong. But you need to know there are other dates. As an example, Orthodox would say that Moses brings Israel out of Egypt in 1440. Others will say, couldn't be, it has to be 1240. I'm thinking, okay, why don't we argue about 200 years? Let's just ignore the fact that he decimated all of Pharaoh's army in the Dead Sea, right? So, but that's the kind of orthodox position. It's going to be from the time of Solomon counting back 400 years.
When were the Dead Sea Scrolls found?
That was 1947.
47. And so the lake dried up, or dried up. I don't know. Where did they
Some
find it?
little boy fence.
Well, this is interesting, so I think we'll go ahead and I could say we'll wait. But
Yeah, no, we can't.
no, we'll get to part of it, but this is interesting. I think you probably would enjoy this. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves.
In cave.
And the reason they're important is they go back 200 years before the time of Christ. Likely collected by somebody called the Essenes. They knew that Rome was eventually going to overpower Israel, so they started hiding all these in clay jars. And in 1947, a young Arab sheep herder was walking down around the Dead Sea. And if you've ever been there, if you haven't been there, you want to go, because it's like, well, let me put it this way. Have you ever driven to Gallup? It's kind of like that. But you will see pockmarked throughout the hills, throughout the mesas, thousands of caves. So this young shepherd goes, he flings a rock, he's playing around, flings a rock, and he hears a crash, goes up to investigate, and he finds the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls in a clay jar.
Wow. And then they just excavated the whole area.
Didn't excavate it.
Not excavated.
They searched, and they found it in numerous caves, and there's literally thousands.
And were these written in Hebrew and Greek?
Both, no, mostly Hebrew, but some in Greek.
So
And
Hebrew is the older language.
much.
Much.
No, actually, Greek is the older language, but Hebrew was the language of the day in Israel at the time. Hebrew and Aramaic. And one last point, and then
Paul was writing in Greek, right?
yes. Boy, you've just done half the class. The importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls is this. Up until that point, the earliest writings that we had were probably 600 AD, the earliest biblical writings. The Dead Sea Scrolls corroborated what has been in our Bible as back as far as 200 before the time of Christ. To the point that you can there's an entire scroll of the book of Isaiah, one of the longest books in the Bible, the entire scroll of Isaiah. If you put it side by side with today's modern Bible, there's 99.9% convergence. That's why it's
So there
important.
is some room.
Does that help?
That's crazy, yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
It's still finding. So,
They are. They're still finding
Really.
writings.
But it's proving everything
Yep.
in scripture dating from years back before.
Including almost an entire collection of the book of Daniel. Do you see how I got us back on track? Pretty slick, huh? Including most of the book of Daniel corresponds to what we have written in our Bibles today. By the way, when we get to part 2, which will be after Thanksgiving, and we start talking about Acts, the first thing we're going to do is go back and say, how come there's so many versions of the Bible and what's the difference? So we'll spend a little time on that. That might be helpful as well. All right, did anybody want to get back to this?
Yes.
But wasn't that interesting?
That was good.
All right. So the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The Assyrians, as you can see, from a period of about 900 to 607 BC, they controlled virtually everything you see here. They controlled pretty much the known world. You're going to see the same kind of pattern as we go through the rest of these. The Assyrians, and here's where we're going to start to read some of these. Somebody want to pick out their Bible, and here's what I'd like you to do, and you'll see it on your handout. I want you to go to Deuteronomy 28, 49 to 52. We're going to read that and then pause, and then we're going to read 64 through 67. Before we get there, while you're getting there, let me tell you why we're doing this. Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 say, keep in mind, Deuteronomy is repetition of what had gone before in the first 4 books. So it's not uncommon that you see in Deuteronomy something that occurred early in the book. In Deuteronomy, or in Leviticus 26, you get something called blessings and curses. And basically, it is blessings if you keep my covenant relationship, curses if you don't. You don't want to read the curses part. We're going to read that here in just a minute. Deuteronomy does the same thing. And basically, it's Moses saying God's covenant relationship. By the way, why did we get to this point to begin with? Because of a broken covenant relationship between God and his chosen people, Israel. That's how we got to the whole point. So Moses said, if you keep God's covenant in Leviticus, and then he's going to say it in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is probably written the last 30 days of his life before Israel comes into the promised land. He's going to say, if you keep my covenant relationship, you're going to be blessed this way. But if you break my covenant relationship, here's what's going to happen. Does somebody have Deuteronomy 49:52? You want to read it loudly?
The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like the eagle, a nation whose language you do not understand. A hard-faced nation who shall not respect the old or show mercy to the young. It shall eat the offspring of your cattle and the fruit of your ground until you are destroyed. It also shall not leave you grain, wine, or oil, the increase of your herds or the young of your flock until they have caused you to perish. They shall besiege you in all of your towns until your high and fortified walls, in which you trusted, come down throughout all your land. And they shall besiege you in all of your towns throughout all of your land, which the Lord your God has given.
Now, do you want to, you didn't do 64 through 67 yet, right? You want to skip over there real quick? Same chapter, verses 64 to 67.
And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve the other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. And among these nations you shall find no respite, and there shall be no resting place for the sole of your foot. But the Lord will give you there a trembling heart and failing eyes and a languishing soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. Night and day you shall be in dread and have no assurance of your life. In the morning you shall say, if only it were evening. And at evening you shall say, if only it were morning, because of the dread that your heart shall feel, and the sights that your eyes shall see.
So I want to say a little bit about that, but while I'm doing it, somebody look up 2 Kings 17. We're going to read verses 5 through 9, and then we're going to skip down and read verses 24 through 28. Let me go back to Deuteronomy here. I want you to notice something. Did you notice what she was reading? She said, a nation will sweep down on you like an eagle. Did you notice when she said that? The eagle was a national symbol of Assyria. Moses is writing this, call it 1400 BC, 700 years before it occurs. Notice something else she said. When she got to verse 64, she said, the Lord will scatter you. Did you notice that? Guess what happens? The Assyrians take the Israelites, and we'll see a little bit about it later, and they scatter them throughout the Assyrian Empire. So they take the northern kingdom in 722, they conquer it, and they scatter Israelites throughout the northern kingdom. At the same time, they're going to bring members of the people from the Assyrian nation and resettle in Israel, in Samaria. I want you to remember that. Before we do that, though, let's go on to note that the prophecy is fulfilled. Who has 2 Kings 17, 5 through 9?
Right here. 17. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah and Gozan on the Tabor River in the towns of the Medes. Keep going. You said 9?
No, yeah, 9.
All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them up from Egypt under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns.
Let's move on. Oh, thanks. Ian's giving me the high sign. So we're going to stop right there. I'm not going to let you know what happened. I'm kidding. Somebody said okay.
High place or high sign?
Matthew, go to 24. Read 24 through 28.
Same chapter.
Yes.
The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord, so he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, "The people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of that country requires. He has sent lions among them, which are killing them off because the people do not know what he requires." 28, you said?
Yeah.
Sorry. Then the king of Assyria gave his order, "Have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the God of the land requires." So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord.
So I want to point out a couple things that he just read, and then I'm going to give you 3 significant points related to this. The first is this. Notice in verse 6, he said, deported the Israelites to Assyria. In other words, all the Israelites, the northern tribes, and they describe it as Samaria, that's the area that Israel occupied, were taken into the Assyrian kingdom. The second thing he said was, he settled Assyrians, in verse 24, settled Assyrians in Samaria to replace the Israelites. So he brought people from Assyria, his subjects, back into Assyria who knew nothing about God Yahweh. So there are 3 significant points to that. Here's the first. This is the first, This is the first of the diaspora, the dispersion of Israel. We'll see a lot more of it later. Here's the second thing. When the Assyrians came into the land, not all the Israelites had been dispossessed. There were still some Israelites in the land. So what happens? They intermarry with the Israelites, creating somewhat of a half-breed group. The third thing that happens is, you remember it says, I'm going to send a priest. Well, the priest comes in, and guess what? The priest only teaches the first 5 books of Moses. He said, that's all you need to know. So the Samaritans only accepted the first 5 books. So the combination of those things, now I want you to think about this for a minute. When we get into Jesus' time, what do you hear about the Samaritans?
They're worthless.
They're worthless. Boo, hiss, right? Now you know why. That's why they were held in such low esteem. When Jesus goes through Samaria to have his appointed time with the woman at the well, that's not normally the way you would have gone to Jerusalem from Galilee. You know how you would have gone? You'd have crossed the Jordan River, come down on the east side of the Jordan River, and go back into Jerusalem just to avoid going into Samaria. Now you know why that is and how that impacted on Jesus' time. All right, let's stop there, and we'll come back next week and do a little bit of the same thing with the Babylonians, and then we'll get into the Persian period. Everybody good with that?
Yes.
Everybody said amen?
Tom Josephus I downloaded before from Kindle.
I'm sorry?
Josephus,
Oh,
Kindle.
so
And cheap.
Matthew says if you want to download Josephus, you can get it on Kindle. Before we get away, before we get away, we need to do, excuse me, we need to do a closing prayer. And I think what we'll do is, as a reward to Vanna for the evening, we'll ask her to do our closing
Put
prayer.
away the tables.
My most gracious and holy Lord, we just thank you